Before we dive into tonight's story, I want to be very honest with you about what we're going to talk about. This is a case involving three 12-year-old girls. Two of them lure their friend into the woods and stab her 19 times. The victim survives, but the intention behind the attack is deadly. The attackers say they did it for a fictional monster they found on the internet. There's no sexual violence here, but there is violence against a child, mental illness, and some disturbing descriptions of what was going through these kids' minds. I'm not going to be graphic, and I'm not here to sensationalize any of this. But it's heavy. If stories involving kids harming other kids, or mental health, or online horror get to you, it's completely okay to bow out now. Your well-being comes first. If you do stay, I want you to keep one image in mind as we go: a 12-year-old girl, bleeding in the leaves, dragging herself toward a bike path because she still wants to live. That girl's name is Payton Leutner. And this is the story of the Slender Man stabbing, when fiction blurred so hard into reality that a suburban forest in Wisconsin became the stage for something none of the adults around them imagined was even possible. Let's rewind to the setting. Waukesha, Wisconsin, 2014. If you've never been to a Midwestern suburb, picture quiet streets lined with modest houses, yards with bikes dropped in the grass, kids walking to school in hoodies with backpacks. Waukesha is a city, but it's the kind of place where middle school feels like its own little universe. Lockers slamming, cafeteria gossip, sleepovers, and the awkward, intense friendships 12-year-old girls are famous for. Payton Leutner, nicknamed Bella by her friends, was one of those kids. She was described as kind, a little shy, the sort of kid who didn't like seeing anyone left out. In 4th grade, she noticed another girl who was sitting alone, Morgan Geyser. Morgan was quirky, offbeat, into fantasy and drawing. She could be intense, but Payton befriended her anyway. That kindness would change her life. By 6th grade, Morgan had another close friend, Anissa Wire, a girl who rode the same school bus. Anissa didn't have many close friends before that. She was sensitive, sometimes teased, a little on the fringe socially. When she and Morgan clicked over their love of fantasy and internet stories, it felt like finding her person. If you've ever been 12, you remember how that feels. Friendships at that age can be clingy, overwhelming, almost like a first love. You share everything: inside jokes, secrets, obsessions. Your world shrinks down to your bedroom, your favorite websites, and the 2 or 3 people you think get you. For Morgan and Anissa, one of those obsessions became Slender Man. If you're older, or you missed the early internet horror boom, Slender Man is a fictional character that started in 2009 on an online forum where people were competing to make creepy images. Someone photoshopped a tall, faceless man in a black suit into the background of old-looking photos of kids, added fake captions, and people started spinning stories around him. Creepypasta, short horror stories passed around online like campfire tales. The mythology grew fast. Slender Man lived in the woods, or in an abandoned mansion. He had long, tentacle-like appendages that could snatch kids. He could teleport. He stalked children, drove people insane, and recruited proxies to do his bidding. None of it was official. There was no one Slender Man canon. It was a community project, a shared collaborative urban legend built out of text posts, grainy images, and fan art. For most people, Slender Man was obviously made up, scary the way a horror movie is scary. You might get spooked scrolling at 1 a.m., but you knew on some level that he was just pixels and words. For some kids, though, especially those who were younger, vulnerable, or already struggling with reality and fantasy, that line could start to blur. Morgan and Anissa spent hours on websites like the Creepypasta wiki, reading Slender Man stories, looking at fan art, and watching videos. They weren't doing this in some dark, underground corner of the web. This was mainstream, kid-accessible internet horror. If you were a middle schooler who liked spooky things, this was almost a rite of passage. The difference with Morgan was that, over time, Slender Man stopped feeling like a story and started feeling like a presence. By 6th grade, Morgan had already shown signs that her inner world was different. She talked about seeing characters other people couldn't see. She seemed detached sometimes, laughing at things that weren't funny or reacting oddly in social situations. At the time, most adults and classmates probably chalked it up to being weird or imaginative. 12-year-olds are not great at recognizing psychosis. Even a lot of adults aren't. Anissa, for her part, was lonely and searching. When she met Morgan, she got pulled into that world. Morgan talked confidently about Slender Man as if he were real, a powerful being who could watch them through screens, who had a mansion in Nicolet National Forest in northern Wisconsin, who might come for them if they defied him. Imagine being 12, not super secure, and your new best friend is telling you, with absolute certainty, that there's a supernatural figure watching and judging you. You're reading story after story that treats him as real. You're looking at eerie images. You're sleeping over at each other's houses, whispering about it in the dark. Pretty soon, Slender Man isn't just entertainment. He's a character in your mental landscape. And then the idea shifts from he's out there to we have to do something about him. This is where things move from spooky to deadly. In their conversations, Morgan and Anissa started to talk about becoming Slender Man's proxies, loyal servants who would live with him in his mansion and be safe from his wrath. The Creepypasta mythology is full of that idea, that if you serve Slender Man, you're spared, even rewarded. But, in those stories, to prove your loyalty, you have to do something for him. You have to kill for him. It's hard to overstate how surreal that is. Two 12-year-old girls in a Midwestern suburb, translating internet folklore into a genuine belief that they needed to kill somebody they knew. According to later interviews, they convinced themselves that if they didn't obey, Slender Man would hurt their families. In their minds, it was a twisted moral calculus: sacrifice one person to save all the others. That's a storyline you see in horror and fantasy over and over. It's also a storyline that, in a mind leaning toward psychosis, can feel like a literal instruction. The person they chose was Payton. Maybe it was because she was close, emotionally and physically. Maybe it was because, in a strange way, they trusted her to follow along with whatever they suggested. Whatever the reason, they decided that the girl who had befriended Morgan back in 4th grade, who had sat with her when she was alone, would be the one they would lead into the woods. They didn't decide this overnight. The plan formed over months. They talked about doing it at a sleepover, or in a park bathroom, or in the woods. They considered different methods. They looked up how to kill someone on the school computers, but those logs wouldn't be checked until after everything happened. At one point, they even thought about killing her in her sleep, believing that would be kinder, because she wouldn't see it coming. This, right here, is one of the most chilling things about this case, the combination of childlike thinking and deadly intent. They're arguing about what's kinder while planning a murder. It's May 30th, 2014. For Payton, it's an exciting day, her friend Morgan's 12th birthday. There's going to be a sleepover. Classic middle school stuff, pizza, games, staying up too late. Payton's parents drop her off, having no idea that anything is wrong. They trust the other family. They trust their daughter's friends. They live in a quiet, safe city. The thought that two kids might be planning to kill their daughter because of a horror character from the internet doesn't even register as a possibility. At the Geyser house, the girls eat, play, and stay up later than they're supposed to. By all accounts, the evening looks normal from the outside. Inside, in the minds of two of those girls, it's a countdown. The next morning, May 31st, they get up and, after some time at the house, ask Morgan's mom if they can go to the nearby park, David's Park. It's something they've done before. It doesn't sound strange. The three girls, two in on the plan, one with no idea, head out into a sunny Wisconsin morning. Their first attempt happens in a bathroom at the park. According to later statements, Morgan and Anissa planned to attack Payton in that bathroom. It was enclosed, private, with floor drains. They thought it would be easier to clean up. Yes, they were thinking that far ahead. But when the moment came, Morgan froze. The reality of stabbing someone face to face must have collided with the abstract planning they'd been doing. They argued quietly. Anissa tried to push her. Morgan couldn't do it. Payton, sensing nothing, just thought her friends were acting a little weird. The plan shifted. They suggested a walk into the woods, an area of brush and trees near the park, close to a bike path. For kids that age, playing in the woods is totally normal. A little bit of independence, a tiny patch of wild, where they can be out of sight for a while. For Payton, it was just part of the day. For Morgan and Anissa, it was the sacrificial altar. Somewhere along that walk, Anissa and Morgan drifted a little ahead of Payton, whispering. Anissa later said she told Morgan, "Go ballistic, go crazy now." They had a steak knife from the Geyser kitchen, hidden in Morgan's waistband. At a spot where the woods thickened and the bike path was out of sight, they told Payton to lie down in the leaves, as if they were going to play some kind of game, hide and seek or make believe. Payton lay down on her stomach, trusting her friends. Then things became chaos. Morgan climbed on top of her. There was fumbling, hesitation. Then the knife came out. 19 stab wounds. Torso, arms, legs. One wound missed a major artery near her heart by a millimeter or two. Another cut deep into her diaphragm. A different stab struck her stomach. These were not little pokes. Some of the wounds were inches deep. As it was happening, 12-year-old girls, children, were saying things like, "I'm sorry," and "be quiet," and "you have to lie still." When you hear the interrogation tapes later, it's jarring how flatly they describe it. That's partly shock and dissociation, and partly the way some kids talk when they don't fully grasp the weight of their actions. After the attack, the plan continued. They told Payton to stay put, to lie down and be quiet, that they would go get help. But that was a lie. The plan was to leave her to bleed out, assume she would die, and then start walking toward the Nicolet National Forest, miles and miles away, as if they could just stroll into Slender Man's mansion. Think about the level of magical thinking in that. Two unprepared 12-year-olds believing they can just walk along the interstate until they reach a mythical monster's house in northern Wisconsin. Payton lay in the dirt and leaves alone. She could have stayed there and died. The girls had stabbed her and left her in a spot where she wouldn't easily be seen from the trail. She was losing blood. Her lungs were filling with it. It hurt to breathe. But Payton didn't stay there. In what can only be described as a staggering act of will for anyone, let alone a 12-year-old, she started to crawl. Inch by inch, she dragged herself out of the denser brush, toward the sound of the road, toward the place where she knew people sometimes rode their bikes. She left a trail of blood in the leaves behind her. Eventually, she reached the edge of a bike path and collapsed, still alive but fading. This is where the story could have split. In another timeline, no one comes down that path in time. In that timeline, the Slender Man stabbing would be a triple tragedy instead of a survival story. But on this morning, a man on a bicycle came around the bend. He saw what at first looked like a child lying in the grass. As he got closer, he saw the blood, the stab wounds, the way she was barely able to talk. He got off his bike, called 911, and stayed with her. On the 911 call, he tells the dispatcher. She says she was stabbed. The operator asks, "By who?" The man answers, "She says her friend." Paramedics arrive. They see immediately that this is critical. They work on stabilizing her, get her into an ambulance, and rush her to the hospital. Surgeons later say that if the knife wound near her heart had gone a fraction of an inch deeper, if she had been found even a few minutes later, she would have died. At the same time, back in Waukesha, Payton's parents are about to receive the kind of phone call no parent ever wants. Meanwhile, Morgan and Anissa are walking. Two 12-year-olds on foot, heading for what they say is Slender Man's mansion in a forest that is, in reality, hours away by car. They have the knife in a bag. They are not hiding. They are not disguising themselves. In their minds, they have crossed some kind of threshold. They're in the story now. Police are already looking for them. An injured child saying she was stabbed by her friend is a fast trigger. Officers fan out. It doesn't take long to spot two young girls walking along the side of a road near a Walmart, their clothes a little dirty, carrying a backpack, looking ordinary. When police stop them, they're surprisingly calm. There's no high-speed chase, no fight. They go along quietly. At the station, they're separated and put into small interview rooms, the kind with cinderblock walls and a table, a couple of chairs, and a camera in the corner. If you ever watch these interrogation tapes, what hits you first is how small they look. They fidget. They pull at their sleeves. Their feet don't quite touch the floor. They talk to detectives with the mix of childlike vocabulary and unnervingly adult content that makes your brain keep saying, "They're only 12," over and over. When detectives ask, "Why did you do this?" they don't say the things we expect to hear in crime stories: jealousy, anger, revenge. They say, "We had to. If we didn't, Slender Man would kill our families." They talk about Slender Man as if he's a real, living entity. They describe his mansion. They say they thought they'd see him in the woods, that he'd come out of the trees. They talk about stabbing their friend, not as an act of personal malice, but as a kind of offering. It's disturbing and, at the same time, strangely heartbreaking. These aren't evil masterminds. They're kids whose understanding of reality is deeply warped, by mental illness, by isolation, by a story that got too real. As the hours go by, more details come out. They had been planning for months. They thought if they killed Payton, they would become proxies, move in with Slender Man, and be safe. They believed he could read their minds, watch them through cameras, punish them if they spoke out. If you imagine a horror movie villain whispering into a vulnerable kid's ear, that's what this sounds like. Only in this case, the villain is a collection of stories and images, and the whisper is their own thoughts echoing back at them in a brain that can't sort fiction from fact. As investigators gather this information, another process starts, the legal machinery. This is where the story stops being just about three girls and turns into a much bigger question about how our justice system handles children, mental illness, and crimes that don't fit cleanly into any one box. Under Wisconsin law, attempted first-degree intentional homicide is one of those charges that automatically lands kids over the age of 10 in adult court. This law was part of a wave of tough-on-crime policies from the 80s and 90s, when people were terrified of so-called super predators and wanted to make sure serious offenders, even very young ones, got serious time. So, almost automatically, both Morgan and Anissa are charged as adults with attempted first-degree intentional homicide. If convicted as adults, they could face decades in prison. That fact alone sparks debate. On one side, you have the raw horror. Two 12-year-olds planned and nearly carried out the murder of their friend. The victim has life-threatening injuries. Parents in Waukesha are terrified. There's a sense that something fundamental has been violated. People say, if you're old enough to do this, you're old enough to face the consequences. On the other side, you have neuroscience and developmental psychology. We know that 12-year-old brains are nowhere near fully developed, especially in areas related to impulse control, long-term planning, and understanding consequences. We also know that the line between fantasy and reality is more fluid for kids, and that mental illness can radically distort that line. And then there's the extra twist here, the internet. Almost immediately, news coverage frames this as the Slender Man stabbing. Headlines ask if online horror is dangerous for kids. Parents start asking what their kids are looking at on their tablets and game consoles. Websites scramble to put disclaimers on their Creepypasta content, clarifying that this is fiction. It's a familiar pattern. We've seen it with violent movies, with heavy metal music, with video games, with rap. Something terrible happens, and we look for the cultural artifact that might have caused it. The truth is almost always more complicated. Millions of kids and teens read Slender Man stories and never hurt anyone. Morgan and Anissa were not ordinary horror fans. They were outliers, kids whose individual vulnerabilities made them take those stories as literal. As the case moves forward, both girls are evaluated by psychologists. The results reveal what, in hindsight, feels inevitable. Morgan, in particular, is deeply mentally ill. She reports seeing things other people don't see, fantasy characters, figures lurking. She describes hearing voices. There's a family history. Her father has been diagnosed with schizophrenia. The signs were there, but before the stabbing, no one had tied them all together as this is emerging psychosis in a 12-year-old. In the psychiatric reports, Morgan is described as having early-onset schizophrenia, a severe mental disorder where the brain struggles to distinguish between what's real and what isn't. Delusions and hallucinations aren't just strong beliefs or imagination. They're experienced as reality. If you genuinely believe that a supernatural entity will kill your parents unless you do what he wants, and your brain is wired in a way that makes that belief feel as solid as the sky is blue, your choices look very different than they do from the outside. Anissa's profile is different, but still deeply disturbed. She doesn't seem to have the same level of psychosis as Morgan, but she's vulnerable to suggestion, socially isolated, and drawn into Morgan's delusional world. Psychologists sometimes use the phrase shared psychotic disorder, or folie à deux, to describe situations where one person's delusion is adopted by another close person. It's rare, but it happens. Both girls spend time in juvenile detention, then in secure mental health facilities, while the legal wrangling begins. Their lawyers try to move the case to juvenile court, where penalties would be lighter and the focus more explicitly on treatment. After hearings and appeals, judges decide to keep the case in adult court, though everyone agrees that mental illness is central. Years tick by as hearings, evaluations, and motions stack up. Payton, meanwhile, is recovering from the attack. Surgeons repair her organs. She goes through physical therapy, learning to move and breathe without pain again. Mentally, she's dealing with trauma, nightmares, fear. Imagine being 12, waking up in a hospital, and being told that the girls you thought were your best friends tried to kill you because of an internet monster. Imagine going back to school later, seeing classmates whisper, seeing your story on the news, knowing your scars are not just physical but deeply psychological. The betrayal is almost as deep as the wounds. In 2017, 3 years after the attack, Anissa's case finally goes in front of a jury, not to decide whether she did it, but to decide whether she should be found guilty or not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect. The insanity defense in American law doesn't mean someone gets away with it. It means acknowledging that they committed the act, but that their mental state at the time was so impaired that they couldn't understand what they were doing was wrong, or couldn't conform their behavior to the law. It's a high bar. Juries don't grant it easily, partly because it's been sensationalized and misunderstood for decades. In Anissa's case, the jury agrees that she has a mental disorder and that it played a key role in her decision-making. They find her not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect. The judge then commits her to a state mental health institution for up to 25 years, with the possibility of petitioning for release earlier if she can show she is stable and no longer a danger. A year later, in 2018, Morgan avoids a trial altogether. She pleads guilty to attempted first-degree intentional homicide, but with the understanding that she will also be found not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect because of her schizophrenia. The judge accepts this and commits her to a secure mental health facility for up to 40 years. For both girls, these are, in some ways, indefinite sentences. There's a maximum, 25 and 40 years, but their actual time in custody depends on periodic reviews, psychiatric evaluations, and the judgment of courts and doctors. They are not in prison, but they are in locked hospitals. They take medication, attend therapy, and live under restrictions most of us would find suffocating. For Payton and her family, these outcomes are complicated. On one hand, the people who stabbed her are not walking free, and there's recognition that what happened to Payton was rooted in severe mental disturbance rather than simple cruelty. On the other, the very phrase "not guilty" can sting when you know in your bones that someone made a choice that nearly ended your life. Payton has been remarkably poised in public. In later interviews, as a teenager, she talked about wanting to live a normal life, about choosing forgiveness, not in the sense of saying what happened was okay, but in the sense of refusing to let what they did define her entire identity. She expressed a wish that her attackers get the treatment they need, even as she carries the scars of what they did every single day. That's a level of grace and maturity most adults would struggle to reach. Legally, the Slender Man case raises a lot of questions that don't have easy answers. How old is old enough to face adult charges? If your crime looks like an adult crime, planned, intentional, carried out with deadly force, but your brain is still very much a child's, what do we do with that? If you truly believed you were saving your family from a supernatural threat, how does that change your moral responsibility? And how much blame, if any, do we place on the stories and platforms that fed your delusion? After the case, there were calls to shut down Slender Man content, to crack down on creepypasta websites, to clean up the internet for kids. Some parents banned scary stories entirely. A few writers and creators who had contributed to Slender Man lore felt such guilt and horror that they distanced themselves from the character completely. But here's the hard truth. The internet is full of stories, horror, fantasy, conspiracy theories, fanfiction, that can be taken in unhealthy directions by vulnerable people. Trying to erase one character or one website doesn't fix the underlying problem. The deeper issues look like this. We have kids with emerging mental illnesses who aren't being evaluated early enough. We have children spending large amounts of time online without adults really understanding what they're consuming or how seriously they're taking it. We have legal systems that were built for a world where influences meant maybe a violent movie or a bad older friend, not a network of stories and imagery that can reach into a 12-year-old's bedroom at all hours. We also have a human brain that is wired for story. From the time we're little, we use fiction to make sense of the world. We project our fears and hopes onto characters. We try on different identities in our minds. For most of us, it's harmless, even helpful. For someone whose grip on reality is already shaky, those same tendencies can become dangerous. The Slender Man legend, by design, plays with ambiguity. He's always in the background of photos. He's rumored, whispered about. Creepypasta sites blurred the lines on purpose with fake found documents and true sightings to make it scarier. It's like telling ghost stories and then insisting to your friend, "No, I swear my cousin saw her." That's fun when everyone in the room is on the same page. It's less fun when one kid in that room doesn't get the wink. That's where adults come in. This case is a brutal reminder that we cannot assume kids are experiencing media the way we are. A story that feels obviously fake to you might feel dangerously real to a 12-year-old who is lonely, bullied, or dealing with unseen mental health issues. It's not about banning everything scary. It's about being present enough in kids' lives to ask, "Hey, what are you reading? Do you think that's real? How do you feel after you look at that stuff?" And being ready to take seriously the answer. It's also about destigmatizing mental health, especially for children. Morgan's schizophrenia did not appear out of nowhere in May 2014. There were signs. But in many families, especially where there's already a history of mental illness, there's a tendency to normalize or minimize odd behavior until something catastrophic happens. We need systems, schools, pediatricians, community mental health resources that can catch those signs earlier. And we need to treat childhood psychosis not as a shameful secret, but as a medical crisis worth all the attention and compassion we give to childhood cancer. Because when we ignore those early warning signs, kids end up in interrogation rooms explaining that they stabbed their friend to appease a monster from the internet. In the years since the Slender Man stabbing, the character has faded a bit from the pop culture spotlight. There was a movie, some controversies, a shift toward other horror trends. But the case itself still lingers in public memory, especially for people in Wisconsin and for parents who remember reading those headlines and thinking, "My God, my kid is that age." It sits in that uncomfortable space where we can't just point at one thing and say, "That's the cause." There's no comfort in locating all the blame in a single monster, fictional or real. Instead, we're left with a web of contributing factors: a lonely child, a psychotic child, a vulnerable friendship, a myth that got too real, a legal system designed for a different era, and a culture that still doesn't quite know what to do when someone says, "I can't tell what's real and what isn't." As we wrap this story, I want to circle back to the girl in the leaves. 19 stab wounds. 12 years old. She dragged herself out of the woods because some part of her, even in unimaginable pain, still believed there was a future on the other side of that bike path. She trusted the stranger who stopped and called 911. She trusted the surgeons and nurses. She went through the hard, boring, exhausting work of healing. She allowed cameras into her life later not because she wanted attention, but because she knew that telling her story might help others understand how something like this can happen. It's easy in cases like this to get sucked into the minds of the attackers, to fixate on how strange and horrifying their beliefs were. And there's value in understanding that. But if we forget the girl who survived, we're missing the heart of the story. Payton Leutner didn't choose to be the protagonist of a real-life creepypasta. She didn't choose to be stabbed in the name of an internet monster. She chose, over and over, to keep going afterward. When we talk about the Slender Man stabbing, we're really talking about much more than a single crime. We're talking about how fragile the line between fantasy and reality can be for a young brain. We're talking about what happens when mental illness is left to simmer in silence. We're talking about the stories we tell and the responsibility we have to help kids process them. And we're talking about a bike path in Wisconsin where a man on a Saturday morning found a girl in the grass and decided to stop. If you were that man, would you have stopped? If you were a parent and your child started talking about a monster in the woods, would you pull the plug on their Wi-Fi, or would you sit down and ask the harder questions? If you were on that jury, listening to two pale, medicated teenagers talk about Slender Man, how would you weigh justice against illness? There are no easy answers. But somewhere, in all of those questions, there's a message this case is trying to leave with us. Fiction is powerful. Minds are fragile. And when a kid tells you what scares them, you should probably listen. Because sometimes, the real horror isn't the monster in the story. It's what can happen when we assume the story could never crawl out of the screen and into the woods behind our house.